She placed the envelope on the front desk at exactly 11:47 at night. She did not leave her name. She did not wait for the security guard to look up from his screen. She set it down on the granite surface with both hands, the way you set down something heavy that you have been carrying for longer than your body was built to carry it. And she straightened the edges against the stone, once, twice, a habit she had developed from years of making sure things were aligned before she walked away from them. Then she turned and walked back toward the service corridor without looking behind her. Her uniform still smelled like the industrial cleaner they used on the ninth-floor marble and the particular staleness of recycled air that lived inside the ventilation ducts she wiped down every Thursday. Her hands were dry from the latex gloves. Her feet ached in the way that feet ache when they have been moving on hard floors for 8 consecutive hours, without a real break. Not the kind of ache that complains loudly, the quiet kind. The kind that has simply become the baseline condition of being alive. He had been watching from the mezzanine level for 13 minutes. He had watched her come off the elevator from the service floor. He had watched her stop at the corridor entrance and look at the envelope in her hands. He had watched her stand completely still for what he estimated was 4 full minutes, not moving, not speaking to anyone, just standing in the corridor with the envelope held in both hands, like a person trying to make a decision that their body already knew the answer to, but their mind had not yet accepted. He had watched her walk to the front desk. He had watched her place it down. He had watched her leave. Adaiza Nwosu did not know she was being watched. She never did, in 3 years of working in this building. That was the nature of the work. You arrived before the people who mattered arrived. You left after the people who mattered left. In between, you moved through the spaces they used, the conference rooms, the executive lounges, the corridors between departments, and you made those spaces clean and functional and ready. And the people who used them registered your presence the way they registered the air conditioning, as infrastructure, as something that simply worked. She clocked out at 11:52 and walked to the staff exit on the side of the building that faced the parking structure. He was already moving. Tobena Okafor did not go to his car. He walked to the black Mercedes idling on the street outside the main entrance and opened the rear door himself before his driver could get out and said 4 words: "Follow her. Stay back." The driver, a quiet man named Pius, who had worked for Tobena for 11 years, and had learned that certain tones meant certain things, pulled away from the curb without asking which woman or why. Tobena watched through the windshield. She walked the way a person walks, when they have a route memorized not by choice, but by repetition. Not fast, not slow. The pace of someone whose body knows the distance and has made peace with it. She crossed the intersection at Broad Street without waiting for the pedestrian signal, because she knew the light timing. She had walked this route before, many times. Every Thursday night for 3 years, this exact route, this exact pace, these exact streets. He told himself he had a practical reason for following her. A person who returns $500,000 in cash without leaving a name is either genuinely honest or performing honesty for an audience they believe is watching, and both of those possibilities were worth understanding. He had built Okafor Continental, one of West Africa's largest freight and supply chain companies, on a single operating principle. Every action has a motive, and every motive, if you are patient enough, reveals itself completely. Generosity without explanation made him uneasy. It was a variable his system had no category for. The city changed around the car as they followed her. The wide commercial streets with their glass-fronted buildings and evenly spaced streetlights gave way to older roads. The pavement here was uneven, patched in places with asphalt that did not quite match the original surface, repaired by people who had the materials available and not the materials required. The storefronts were different here, a pharmacy with one fluorescent tube flickering behind its sign. A provisions store still open at midnight, blue light from a refrigerator unit visible through the open doorway. A woman selling ground nuts from a tray balanced on her head, moving slowly in the opposite direction, unhurried in the way of someone for whom the night shift has no end time. Tobena had driven through this neighborhood before. His company's logistics depot was 12 minutes south of here. He had approved the routing maps himself, had reviewed the access roads, had signed off on the lease for the depot warehouse. He had driven through this neighborhood to get there, and he had never once looked at what existed between the highway junction and the warehouse gate. It had not occurred to him that anything worth looking at existed in that space. She turned left onto Ikenna Close. The sedan followed at 2 full blocks of distance. The streetlights here were inconsistent. Several were dead entirely. The ones that functioned cast a yellowish light that made everything beneath them look impermanent, as if the light itself was not planning to stay long. She stopped in front of a building on the corner of Ikenna Close and Obiora Street. 4 floors. Painted concrete exterior, once cream, now the color of old paper, with watermarks running down the front face from the roofline to the second-floor windows. The entrance had a metal security door that had been propped open with a folded piece of cardboard wedged under the bottom corner. The intercom panel beside the door had wires coming out of it where the speaker unit had been removed. She did not go inside immediately. She stood on the pavement for what Tobena estimated was nearly 2 full minutes. She set down the bag she was carrying. She reached up and retied her hair, pulling it tighter, smoothing it back. She bent down and changed her shoes. The flat rubber-soled shoes she wore for work went into the bag, and she replaced them with a different pair, slightly cleaner, softer looking, the kind of shoes you wear not for work but for home. She straightened her jacket. She wiped something from beneath her left eye with the back of her hand. She rolled her shoulders back. She lifted her chin. She arranged her face into something that was not quite a smile, but was close enough to function as one, if you were not paying careful attention to the difference. Tobena was paying careful attention. He had watched people prepare for board presentations worth hundreds of millions. He had watched lawyers compose themselves outside courtroom doors. He had watched investors arrange their faces before walking into negotiations that would define the next decade of their professional lives. He recognized the specific mechanics of it, the deliberate assembly of a version of yourself that the people on the other side of the door needed to see. This woman was doing the same thing on a pavement on Ikenna Close at midnight before walking into her own home. She was building a face for whoever was inside. She did not want them to see what the shift had cost her. She did not want them to know how tired she was. She was constructing composure under a broken streetlight beside a building with cardboard in its security door. She went inside. The door swung shut behind her. A light came on in a window on the 3rd floor. The glow was warm, the particular warmth that comes from a lamp placed deliberately rather than an overhead bulb, the warmth of someone who cared what the room felt like when they were in it. Tobena sat in the back of the Mercedes and did not tell Pius to drive. He did not reach for his phone. He did not check the time. He sat looking up at the 3rd floor window, the way a person looks at something they did not expect to be looking at, and cannot immediately explain why they cannot look away. He took out his phone. He opened his notes application. He typed the address. 14 Ikenna Close, flat 3B. He saved it. He put the phone back in his pocket. He told Pius to take him home. On the drive back, the streets reversed themselves in the same sequence they had changed. The uneven pavement became smooth. The patched repairs disappeared. The flickering pharmacy sign gave way to the lit facades of restaurants that were still open and still occupied at this hour, the kind of places that had wine lists and sound systems and hostesses who remembered regular customers by name. Tobena did not notice the transition. He was thinking about the 2 minutes on the pavement, about what kind of exhaustion requires that much preparation to conceal, about the distance between the granite reception desk, where she had placed the envelope, and the piece of cardboard wedged in her front door, about the shoes she had changed in the street, because whoever was waiting upstairs should not have to see the shoes she wore to clean other people's floors. He had the address. He did not yet know what he was going to do with it. Adaeze Nwosu had woken up at 5:20 that morning. Her body no longer needed an alarm. It had not needed one in 4 years. The shift ended at midnight. She was home by 12:40 on good nights. Later, when the last bus ran behind schedule, and she had to wait. She slept from 1 in the morning to 5:20. If her children did not wake her before that, they usually did. She had not slept more than 5 hours on any night in 4 years. She had stopped counting. Chiamaka was already at the kitchen table when Adaize came out of the bedroom. 8 years old, homework spread in front of her, on the small table that served as both dining surface and study space. A bowl of pap she had prepared herself, using the instructions Adaize had written on a piece of paper, taped to the inside of the cupboard door, because Chiamaka had asked once to be taught, and Adaize had understood immediately that the asking was not about pap. It was about not wanting to be a burden, she had taught her. Now Chiamaka made it herself, on school mornings, when Adaize had not yet risen and did not make a noise about it. Adaize looked at the bowl. She looked at the homework. She looked at her daughter, who had organized her own morning like a woman twice her age, because the only alternative was asking for help from someone who had very little left to give. She did not say anything about it. She kissed the top of Chiamaka's head. She went to check on Emeka. Emeka was 5 years old. He was sitting on the floor of the room he shared with his sister, surrounded by the large format cardboard cards Adaize had made for him by cutting up the backs of cereal boxes and writing pictures on them in thick marker. He was not looking at the cards. He was arranging them in a sequence that made sense to him, a system of ordering she had not taught him and did not fully understand, but that he returned to every morning with the focused consistency of someone working through something important. Emeka had a developmental language delay. The developmental pediatrician at the public hospital had used that phrase at his 3-year review, and Adaize had carried it in her chest since that afternoon, like something she could not set down and could not swallow. She had written it in a small notebook she kept in her bag because she wrote down everything medical in that notebook, dates and names and words she did not yet understand, so she could look them up later at the Internet Cafe, 2 streets from the school where Chiamaka attended, and where 30 minutes of access cost 150 naira. Speech therapy was what Emeka needed. Everyone with any knowledge of the situation agreed on this. The specialist at the teaching hospital had said it at his last appointment 6 months ago. The school assessment officer who had evaluated him had said it. The community health worker who visited the building twice a year and filled in forms on a clipboard had said it, nodded sympathetically, and written a referral that had not produced an appointment. Private speech therapy in Lagos cost between 15,000 and 35,000 naira per session, depending on the provider and the location. 2 sessions per week was the minimum recommended. Adaize earned 68,000 naira per month. After rent, utilities, food, Chiamaka's school fees and transport, what remained at the end of each month ranged from 3,000 to 8,000 naira, depending on what had broken or run out that month. The public hospital therapy program had a waiting list. She had been on it for 14 months. Nobody had contacted her. She called the number on the referral letter every 3 months. Each time, a different voice told her the list was being processed, and she would be contacted when a space became available. She had made her own version in the meantime. Every Saturday morning, she went to the community library on Benson Street and checked out picture books, the kind with large, simple images and single words beneath them. She made vocabulary cards from cereal box cardboard. She taped a new word list to the inside of the kitchen cupboard every week, replacing the previous one, and every evening before she left for her shift, she sat with Emeka on the floor, and they went through the cards together. She said the word. She showed him the picture. She waited for him to try. He tried. Not every evening, not every word, but he tried, with the patient seriousness of a child who understood that something important was being asked of him, even if he could not yet say what it was. When he could not say what he wanted to say, he showed her. He had developed his own visual language for the things his mouth had not yet found. A drawing of the sun meant he was happy. A drawing of rain meant something was wrong and he needed her close. A drawing of Chiamaka meant he wanted his sister, and one image he returned to more than any other. A circle drawn in yellow crayon on whatever surface was available. The moon, which had become his word for everything that mattered, and could not yet be spoken, because the story they read together every night before her shift began had a moon on the cover, and the moon had become the thing he showed her when he meant, "I need you, and I love you, and please don't go." Adayeze looked at Emeka on the floor that morning. He looked up and held out a piece of paper. A yellow circle, the crayon pressed so hard into the surface that the paper had gone slightly rough with it. She took it from him and put it on the refrigerator with the others, pressing the tape down with her thumb before she turned back to make his breakfast, so he would not see her face while she did it. She fed the children. She checked the school bus timing. She packed Chiamaka's lunch. She sat at the kitchen table for 3 minutes while both children were in the other room, pressed the heels of her hands against her closed eyes, and breathed, not because she was about to cry, but because there was a pressure behind her eyes that had become physical, and this was the only way she had found to ease it without anyone seeing. Then she stood up. She washed her hands. She started the day. She did not know, that morning, that in 14 hours she would be emptying a waste bin in the executive rest suite on the 9th floor and find inside it an unsealed envelope containing $500,000 in cash. The executive rest suite on the 9th floor was the last room on Adeze's Thursday rotation. She cleaned it between 10:30 and 11 at night. The room was different from the rest of the floor. Higher ceilings, a different grade of carpet, furniture that had weight to it rather than the functional lightness of standard office pieces. There was a beverage station with a machine that produced coffee in 12 different preparations, and that cost, she had once read on its service label, more than 4 months of her salary. There was a seating arrangement of 4 deep chairs around a low table, and along the far wall, a series of individual work desks with privacy panels. The waste bin at the end of the room was brushed steel, heavy, the kind of fixture chosen for appearance rather than function. She had been emptying it every Thursday for 3 years. It usually contained espresso capsules, folded napkins, the occasional printed document that had been torn once before discarding, the small evidence of people who worked in rooms like this and did not think about what happened to the things they threw away. Tonight it contained an envelope, cream-colored, letter-sized, unsealed, no name written on the outside. She picked it up to transfer it to her collection bag with the rest. It was heavy. She stopped. She opened the flap. Inside, arranged in tight, even bundles secured with paper bands, were stacks of $100 bills. She counted the first bundle. She stopped. She counted it again. 100 notes. $10,000. There were 50 bundles. She set the envelope on the low table beside the waste bin. She stepped back from it. She stood looking at it for 4 minutes. She did not touch it again during those 4 minutes. She simply looked at it the way you look at something that could change the entire direction of your life if you allowed it to. If you decided that finding something meant keeping it. If you decided that need was sufficient justification. If you decided that no one watching meant no one accounting. She thought about Emeka. She thought about 14 months on a waiting list and a voice that said processing every 3 months. She thought about 35,000 naira per session, multiplied by 2 sessions per week. She thought about Chiamaka's school fees that were due in 6 weeks, and the envelope she had been putting 2,000 naira into every week since January, and that currently held 19,000 naira against a bill of 45,000. She thought about the roof over their beds, which leaked at the corner above the window every rainy season, and which the building landlord had been promising to fix since the previous year. She thought about all of it. She picked up the envelope. She folded it once and placed it in the inner pocket of her work coat. She finished cleaning the rest suite. She moved to the service stairwell and cleaned the landing. She went down to the lobby level and mopped the entrance corridor. She worked for 45 minutes with the envelope inside her coat, going about her rotation with the same steady rhythm she brought to every Thursday shift. Then she stopped. She was in the lobby. the mop still in her hand, and she stopped moving and stood completely still in the empty corridor and thought about her father. His name had been Chukwuemeka Nwosu. He had been an electrician in Onitsha, a careful and unhurried man who spoke slowly and fixed things thoroughly, and had one sentence he said more often than any other, a sentence Adaize had heard so many times in her childhood that it had stopped being words and become something more like a physical law, like gravity, like the fact that water runs downward. What is not yours will cost you more than what it is worth. He had said it when she found a wallet in the market at 9 years old, with 800 naira inside it, and brought it to him with the face of a child who has discovered that the universe sometimes puts money in your path for no reason. He had walked her back to the market and asked her to retrace her steps and find the stall where she had found it, and she had. And they had stood there for 20 minutes until the man who had dropped it came back looking for it, and Adaize had given it back, and her father had not praised her for it. He had simply said, "Now you know." She took the envelope from her coat. She walked to the reception desk. She placed it on the granite surface with both hands. She took a notepad from the reception desk, the kind kept for visitors, and tore one sheet from it. She wrote 7 words, "Found in executive suite, Thursday night staff." She placed the note on top of the envelope. She straightened the edges of the envelope against the stone, twice. Then she turned and walked back toward the service corridor. She did not look back. She did not know that Tobena Okafor had been watching from the mezzanine for 13 minutes. She did not know that he had arrived late to a building he owned, had taken the mezzanine walkway to avoid the lobby, and had stopped when he saw her come off the service elevator with the envelope in her hands. She did not know that he had stood completely still for 13 minutes, watching her make a decision with $500,000 in her hands at 11:47 at night in an empty lobby. She did not know any of this. She clocked out at 11:52. She changed her shoes on the pavement outside. She walked home. She went upstairs to her children. The man who had watched her walk away from $500,000 without leaving her name sat in the back of a black Mercedes on a dark street and looked up at a warm light in a third-floor window and did not go home for a long time. Tobena Okafor was 59 years old, and he had built everything he owned with his hands before he had the money to pay other people to build things for him. He had started with a single flatbed truck and a route between Lagos and Kano that he drove himself, sleeping in the cab at fuel stations along the expressway, because the cost of a guest house room was money that belonged in the diesel tank. He was 24 years old. He had no investors, no family capital, no connections to the kind of people who open doors with phone calls. He had a truck he had bought with borrowed money, a logbook he kept in precise handwriting, and the understanding, arrived at early and held firmly, that the only way out of where he had started was to be more reliable than everyone around him, every time, without exception. By 32, he had a fleet of 12 trucks. By 40, he had a company. Okafor Continental Logistics, regional freight, last-mile distribution, cold chain management, warehouse operations across 7 countries. He had built it the way a man builds something when the alternative is returning to the starting point. And he had decided at 24 that returning to the starting point was not available to him as an option. He sold the company at 46 for a number that appeared in the financial press with the word landmark attached to it. He bought it back at 49 because the people who purchased it did not understand what a logistics company actually was. It is the specific trust between a dispatcher in Kano and a driver in Ibadan at 2 in the morning when a delivery is running late and a decision needs to be made in 4 minutes. It is the relationship between a warehouse supervisor and the staff who have worked under him for 6 years. It is the accumulated reliability of 10,000 kept promises between people whose names never appear on a balance sheet. The buyers broke that trust in 26 months. Tobena rebuilt it in 14. He was 59 now. He ran Okafor Continental from the 14th floor of a building on Adeola Odeku Street in Victoria Island that he also owned. His net worth was a number he had stopped checking, not because it no longer mattered, but because at a certain threshold, a number stops being information and becomes something closer to weather, present, significant, not something you can do very much about on a daily basis. His wife Ngozi had died 5 years ago. Ovarian cancer. He had built an entire professional life on the principle that problems had solutions, and solutions required action, and action required speed. Ngozi's illness had no solution. It only had time, and time moved at its own pace, regardless of what he needed. Ngozi had been a secondary school biology teacher in Surulere when he met her. She was 27, he was 29, and the fleet had just reached 4 trucks, and he was still driving one of them himself, on the days when a driver called in sick. She had been his neighbor's cousin, introduced at a naming ceremony on a Saturday afternoon, and she had spent the first 20 minutes of their conversation correcting something he said about plant cell biology that he had not realized he had said incorrectly. He had found this entirely remarkable. Nobody corrected him, not his staff, not his partners, not the people he did business with. They deferred, or they disagreed quietly, or they waited until he had left the room. She looked him in the eye and said, "That is not how osmosis works." He had asked for her number before the food was served. Ngozi had a particular quality that he had spent 5 years since her death trying to describe accurately to himself, and had never fully managed. She saw people, not in the general charitable sense of caring about humanity. She saw specific people. The gateman at their house on Ikoyi, a man named Bello who had worked there for 9 years. Ngozi knew his wife's name, and his children's school, and the name of his village in Kebbi State, and the specific variety of mangoes his mother grew in the compound at home. She knew, because she had asked. She asked everyone. She remembered everything. She made it her business to know the full shape of the life of every person who moved through the edges of hers. She had done this to Tobena as well, in the early years. She had asked questions about his childhood in Onitsha that nobody had ever asked, about his mother's face and his father's voice, and the specific smell of the room where he had grown up. And he had answered them with the discomfort of a man who had spent years treating his own history as information to be stored rather than territory to be revisited. She made him look down, not at balance sheets, down, at the driver waiting in the rain outside the depot because the covered area had not yet been built, at the cleaner in the building lobby whose name appeared nowhere in any document he had ever signed, at the woman behind the canteen counter who had been serving him lunch 3 days a week for 4 years, and whose name he had never learned, and whose existence he had registered with the same peripheral acknowledgement with which he registered furniture. Slowly, over 5 years, the city had returned to its previous configuration in his perception. People had resettled into categories: workers and executives, service providers and clients, the visible and the infrastructure. He had not done this deliberately. He had simply stopped being corrected, and without correction, the old defaults had returned. 2 years after Ngozi died, a man named Roland Eze had approached him at a foundation dinner with a proposal. A clean water project in the Niger Delta, boreholes, filtration systems, community distribution networks. Roland was smooth in the way of men who have spent years perfecting the performance of sincerity. He had reports. He had a registered foundation with an audited account and a board of trustees whose names were recognizable. Tobena had written a check for 1.2 billion naira. The investigation that followed, 18 months later, established that approximately 200 million naira had gone toward actual water infrastructure. The rest had been distributed across a network of shell accounts, consultancy fees paid to entities that did not exist, and the renovation of Roland Eze's house in Asokoro, which now had a swimming pool. He did not recover the money. He recovered something that cost him more: a conviction, a settled, specific, evidence-based conviction that had been forming in him for years before the fraud, and that the fraud had simply finished building. He began testing this, not dramatically, quietly, in the way of a man running an experiment he has designed carefully and does not need to tell anyone about. He had placed 4 envelopes in his building on Adeola Odeku Street over the previous 3 months. Each contained $5,000 in cash. One in the 3rd-floor break room on the staff side of the pantry, one in the stairwell between the 7th and 8th floor, placed on the window ledge beside the fire extinguisher cabinet, one in the supply storage room on the 11th floor, one in the executive rest suite on the 9th floor. 3 of the 4 had disappeared without report. No note, no mention to security, no incident filed with building management. Gone. The 4th was sitting on the reception desk with a handwritten note on top of it, except that it was not $5,000. Tobena had placed $5,000 in the executive rest suite envelope. The accounts department had called him this morning to confirm the envelope recovered from reception. They had counted it in the presence of 2 staff members and a security supervisor. $500,000. He had sat with that number for a long time. 5,000 and 500,000 were not a rounding error. They were not a counting mistake. They were not the same envelope, which meant that somewhere in the executive rest suite on the 9th floor, on a Thursday evening, a second envelope had been present. An envelope that contained $500,000 in cash and that did not belong to the experiment he had designed. He had pulled the building access records for the executive rest suite before making any other inquiry. 2 entries on Thursday before Adacie's cleaning rotation. The first was his own card, at 6:47 in the evening, when he had used the rest suite briefly before a dinner meeting. The second entry was at 8:15. The card registered belonged to his son, Remy Okafor. Remy was 31 years old. He was the kind of man who had been given everything and had never once been required to account for what that meant. Tobena understood this, in the way that parents understand things about their children that they do not fully accept responsibility for. Remy had grown up after the fleet became a company and the company became a name. He had attended schools where the fees were not a constraint, but a formality. He had attended university in the United Kingdom, not because his results required it, but because his father's accountant had made a suggestion, and Tobena had agreed without thinking about what it meant for a 20-year-old to be given everything without earning any of it. Remy worked in the company. He held a position, senior partnerships manager, that had been created for him in the way positions are sometimes created, not because an organizational need exists, but because someone needs somewhere to put a person they are responsible for. He was not incompetent. He was not unkind. He held doors open and said the right words in meetings, and dressed well, and remembered people's names when it was professionally useful to do so. But he had no concept of weight. This was the word Tobena kept returning to. Weight. The weight of a number. The weight of a decision. The understanding that $500,000 left on a table was a specific quantity of time in other people's lives. Time measured in night shifts and school fees, and medication that could or could not be afforded. Remy did not feel that weight because he had never been required to. In his life, $500,000 was not a weight. It was a figure, a cell in a spreadsheet, a number that existed without consequence. Tobena had learned this about his son gradually and had done very little about it, which was its own kind of failure. He called Remy at 7 in the morning. The call went to voicemail. He called again. On the 3rd call, Remy answered with the voice of someone who had been asleep. There was an envelope in the executive rest suite last Thursday. Did you leave something there? A pause. The sound of someone becoming more awake than they wanted to be. I had a meeting there at 8. Private. I brought cash for... I was going to pay someone for something. I ended up doing a transfer instead. I must have left the envelope on the table. How much was in it? Another pause. Longer this time. I'm not sure exactly. Around $500,000. Yes. You left $500,000 on a table, and you did not notice it was gone. It was not a question. Remy did not answer immediately. Then, I noticed the next day. Through the window, the early Lagos morning was already loud. Generators and traffic, and the particular layered noise of a city that starts its working day before the sun is fully up. He thought about Adayeze Nwosu. He thought about the 13 minutes he had watched her stand in the corridor with that envelope. He thought about her hands, which had been completely still, not trembling, still. The stillness of someone exercising a very large amount of control over something very difficult. He thought about the 2 minutes on the pavement outside her building, the shoes she had changed, the face she had prepared for her children. He thought about what $500,000 represented to a woman who walked home from a night shift because the last bus had gone and she could not afford a taxi. She had held it in her hands. She had put it in her coat. She had walked 45 more minutes of her rotation with it, and then she had walked to the reception desk and put it down. He opened his laptop and sent one message to the head of human resources. One line only. Full profile on the night cleaning staff for the 9th floor executive suite. Thursday rotation. Send to me directly. The reply came in 11 minutes. Adayeze Nwosu. Employee number 2847. Night shift custodial team. 3 years and 4 months continuous service. Emergency contact listed as a neighbor in flat 3A of the same building. Not a spouse, not a family member. Not open the full personnel file. He opened the summary page. 3 years of quarterly reviews. Every performance category rated satisfactory or above. No disciplinary incidents. No schedule change requests. No salary advance requests. 0 sick days taken in the current year, despite an entitlement of 8 days under the custodial contract. At the bottom of the most recent quarterly review, the night shift supervisor, a man named Emeka Ude, who had supervised the cleaning team for 6 years, had written a comment in the notes field. 4 sentences, punctual without exception. Work quality consistently above minimum standard. Never complains. Never asks for anything. Tobena read the last sentence twice. Never asks for anything. He had read that phrase before on performance reviews. He knew what managers meant when they wrote it. They meant low maintenance, easy to manage, undemanding. He read it differently now. He read it as a description of someone who had concluded, through accumulated evidence, that asking was a transaction with a poor return, that having needs you expressed out loud was a vulnerability you could not afford, that the safest operating position was self-sufficiency carried so quietly that the people around you forgot you had needs at all. He picked up his phone and called his personal assistant, not the company one, the one who handled matters that did not belong in official channels. I need a background report on an employee. Discreet, not through HR. Her name is Adayeze Nwosu. The report came back by noon. Single mother, 2 children, a daughter aged 8, a son aged 5. The son had a developmental language delay, documented at his 3-year assessment. He had been placed on a waiting list for speech therapy through the public health system 14 months ago. The waiting list estimate at time of placement had been 12 to 18 months. He had not yet received an appointment. The family lived in a single-family flat in a building on Ikena Close in Surulere. The flat was rented at below market rate through a community housing arrangement, the kind of informal tenancy that exists in Lagos between landlords who cannot maintain their properties and tenants who cannot afford properties that are maintained. Adayeze Nwosu earned 68,000 naira per month. She had no secondary income on record, though the analyst noted that her transit history suggested weekend movement consistent with someone running additional errands that extended beyond typical domestic range. She had not enrolled in any of the company's employee assistance programs. She had not accessed the child care subsidy benefit available to all full-time staff. She had not applied for the Education Support Fund, which covered certification costs for hourly employees, and which had an enrollment rate across the company's full workforce of less than 2%. Tobena read that last line 3 times. Less than 2%. The fund had existed for 5 years. It was written into the operating budget. It had been approved at board level, and fewer than 2 in every 100 eligible employees had ever used it. Not because they did not need it. Because nobody had told them it existed. Because the information was buried in a benefits document that most hourly staff never received, and the ones who received it never read. Because it was written in the language of HR compliance rather than the language of people who needed to know that help was available. He closed the report. He sat at his desk for a long time. He thought about Roland Eze and the 1.2 billion naira and the swimming pool in Asokoro. He thought about 3 envelopes that had disappeared from his building without a word. He thought about the sentence from the performance review. He thought about Ngozi, about the way she had stood in the kitchen of their Ikoyi house one evening, looking at him with an expression he had only learned to read accurately in retrospect. An expression that meant, "You are not seeing what is in front of you, and I am deciding whether to say so." She usually said so. He opened his notebook. He wrote 1 line. "What you test for reveals what you believe is rare." He sat with the line for a moment. Then he picked up his phone and called Pius. "Bring the car to the front. No driver uniform today. Just come as you are." The building on Ikena Close looked different in afternoon light than it had at midnight. Tobena sat in the front passenger seat of an unmarked car. He had told Pius to use his personal vehicle, a modest Camry that would not register as significant on this street, and looked at the building across the road. The water stains on the facade were more visible in daylight, brown streaks running from a section of damaged roofing down the front face of the building, in a pattern that showed where the rain entered and where it ran. The window on the second floor that had been patched with plastic sheeting was visible from here. On the ground floor, the building's entrance, the security door still had the same piece of cardboard wedged beneath it. 14 hours had passed since he had watched Adeyeze walk through that door. The cardboard had not moved. He was not sure what he had come to do. He was sure that the report on his desk and the envelope on the reception desk and the 13 minutes on the mezzanine were connected to something he did not yet have language for, and that he needed to look at it more directly than a 1-page summary allowed. At 4:15, a bus stopped at the corner of Ikena Close and Obiora Street. A woman got off. She was carrying 2 bags, one in each hand. The bag on the left was heavier. Groceries. From the shape of it, the weight of it visible in the angle of her shoulder. The bag on the right was lighter and rectangular. Library books. He could see the edge of a return date sticker on the spine of the top book from this distance. She walked toward the building. Before she reached the entrance, the security door opened from inside. A girl appeared. 8 years old, in a school uniform that had been ironed, the collar precise. She looked at her mother, looked at the heavier bag, and took it from her hand without being asked or told. The motion was completely natural, practiced. This was a system they had built together through repetition, an economy of effort developed between 2 people who understood instinctively that the household ran on cooperation and that cooperation in their household was not optional. The girl went back inside. Adeyeze did not follow immediately. She stopped at the entrance. A small face appeared at the glass panel of the security door. Her son. He was pressing something flat against the glass, a piece of paper, holding it up so she could see it from outside. Tobena could not see the drawing clearly from this distance, but he saw Adeyeze's face when she looked at it. The careful smile, not a performance this time, something private, the specific expression of a person receiving something that costs the giver everything, and the giver does not know it yet. She opened the door and took the paper from his hands. She held it, the way you hold something that matters. Then she went inside. The 3rd-floor window lit up, the warm lamplight. Tobena sat in the car and did not move for a long time. Through the window he could see the kitchen. Adeyeze at the small table, Chiamaka beside her with a notebook open, Emeka on the chair closest to his mother, a book open in front of them both. She was reading to him, her finger tracing words on the page, her mouth forming them slowly and clearly, and the boy's eyes moving between the page and her lips and back to the page with the focused attention of someone learning a language through total immersion. On the refrigerator behind them, visible even from the street, a row of drawings. Yellow circles, small figures, a sun, a moon, each one fixed to the door with tape, each one given a specific place, treated not as children's scribble, but as communication, as the record of a mind working hard to say the things it had not yet found words for. Below the drawings, a handwritten list. He could not read the words from here, but the format was clear, organized, deliberate, a teaching tool she had made herself and updated regularly because the system that should have provided this had placed her on a list and left her there. Tobena watched the kitchen window for 11 minutes. He did not reach for his phone. He did not think about the office. He did not think about quarterly projections or the board meeting on Friday, or the 7 messages his assistant had flagged before 5 o'clock. He thought about Ngozi, standing in the kitchen on Ikoyi in 2014, looking at him with that expression. He thought about what she would say if she were sitting in this car right now. He already knew what she would say. She would say, "You have been sitting outside this woman's window for 11 minutes. Stop watching and do something." He told Pius to take him home. That evening, alone in his study, he opened the Employee Assistance Fund guidelines for the first time in 5 years. He read all 41 pages. He identified 7 categories of support that Adenise Nwosu was eligible for, that she had never accessed, not because she did not qualify, but because the document containing this information had never been made available to her in a language or format she could act on. He opened a new document. He began writing, not a memo, not a policy revision, something more direct, a plan. And somewhere in the middle of writing it, without intending to, he wrote a sentence that surprised him. She did not need to be found. She was already there. We were the ones who were not looking. He stopped. He read the sentence. He did not delete it. He saved the document. He closed the laptop. He opened the drawer of his desk. Inside was a letter, written in handwriting that had shaken slightly, because the hand that wrote it had been weak, but had pressed firmly anyway, because the person who wrote it had something to say and intended to say it clearly. Ngozi's last letter. He had read it 241 times. He had counted. It was a habit he had developed in the first year after her death and had never stopped. He unfolded it now. Her handwriting, uneven from the illness, but deliberate. You will spend your whole life measuring things. That is who you are. Just make sure that at some point you stop long enough to measure what actually matters. The person who cleaned the floor you walked on today, the driver who waited in the rain, the child whose name you never learned. Those are the measurements that count. He read it once. He folded it. He placed it back in the drawer. He sat in the quiet of his study for a long time. Tomorrow morning, he was going to knock on a door on Ikena Close. He was going to do it himself, without an assistant, without a prepared document, without an HR intermediary or a formal scheduling process. He was going to knock on the door and speak to a woman who had held $500,000 in her hands and given it back. And he was going to do it before he convinced himself that there was a more controlled, more structured, more professionally appropriate way to handle it. Because Ngozi had spent 17 years teaching him that the more controlled way was usually the way you chose when you were afraid of what happened if you looked directly at something. He had been looking away for 5 years. It was enough. He knocked at 8:15 on a Saturday morning. Not the building entrance. The 3rd floor, flat 3B. He had climbed the stairs himself, past the smell of cooking oil and morning soap and the particular layered scent of a building where many families lived in close proximity and conducted their lives without much distance between them. The stairwell light on the 2nd floor landing was not working. He had felt his way up the last flight with one hand on the wall. He knocked once, then waited. He heard movement inside, a child's voice, indistinct, then footsteps, the kind that move with purpose rather than leisure, the footsteps of someone already in the middle of something who has been interrupted. The door opened. Adaeze Nwosu looked at him the way a person looks at something that has appeared in entirely the wrong context. She was wearing a plain house dress and her hair was wrapped. She was holding a wooden spoon. Behind her, the kitchen was active, something on the stove, steam visible, the smell of onions and crayfish moving through the doorway. She recognized him. He could see the moment it happened. A slight stillness, a recalibration, the specific expression of someone who has just understood that the situation they are standing in is more complicated than it appeared 2 seconds ago. She did not step back. She did not widen the door. She held it at the same angle she had opened it, which told him something. "My name is Tobena Okafor," he said. "I own the building where you work. I know who you are. I know what you returned on Thursday night." He paused. "It was not my envelope." She was quiet. He continued, "I had placed an envelope in that room as part of something I was doing. $5,000. Your envelope contained $500,000. The money belonged to my son. He left it in the rest suite after a meeting and did not realize it was gone." She said nothing. "I am not here about the money. The money is not the reason I am standing here." He paused again. "I am here because I watched you from the mezzanine for 13 minutes on Thursday night. I watched you make a decision with $500,000 in your hands. And then I watched you walk home." The wooden spoon was still in her hand. Her expression had not changed in any way he could read as either welcome or refusal. She was simply looking at him with the full, direct attention of someone who has decided that whatever is happening, she will face it standing up. She opened the door the rest of the way. "Come in," she said. She said it without warmth and without hostility, in the tone of a person who has made a practical assessment and acted on it. He came in. The apartment was exactly what he had seen from the street, and it was also entirely different. From the street, it had been a space defined by its limitations. The small windows, the modest dimensions visible even from outside, the building around it that communicated scarcity in its every peeling surface and propped open door. From inside, it was something else. Every surface was clean, not cleaned recently, continuously. The kind of cleanliness that exists, not because someone has just tidied, but because cleanliness has been maintained as a daily practice, a value, the way some people maintain quiet or order or routine. The kitchen was small and precisely organized. The single shelf above the gas cooker held containers that were labeled in a clear hand. The table had a cloth on it, a simple printed cotton, washed soft from many uses. On the refrigerator, exactly as he had seen from the street, the drawings. The yellow circles, the small figures, the sun, the moons. Below them, a handwritten word list in clear capital letters. Speech words, week 19, with 7 words listed beneath the heading and a small drawing beside each one. Below that, 3 photographs held up with strips of masking tape, school photographs, Chiamaka in her uniform, a younger Emeka in what appeared to be a naming ceremony outfit, and 1 photograph of an older man and woman that had the specific quality of an image that has been handled many times. Her parents, he thought. Adaze gestured to the chair at the kitchen table. He sat. She turned back to the stove, lowered the heat under a pot, and then turned to face him with the spoon still in her hand and her full attention on him. He told her what he had come to say. He did not make it long. He did not dress it in the language of corporate programs or HR initiatives. He spoke in plain words, the way he had learned to speak in the early years, in the years of the truck and the logbook and the fuel station forecourts, when there was no time or space for language that meant something other than what it said. He told her about the Employee Assistance Fund. He told her that it had existed for 5 years, that it covered education, certification, child developmental services, and several other categories of support, and that the reason she did not know about it was a failure of communication within his company that was his responsibility and that he intended to address. He told her that she was eligible. He told her what that meant specifically, in numbers, in practical terms. He told her that the developmental services rider covered speech-language therapy for dependent children, 2 sessions per week, with no waiting list, no cap, and no requirement beyond employment status she already held. He watched her face while he said this last part. She was very still. He continued. "There is also a position," he said. "It has not been advertised yet. Operations Coordinator, entry-level management. The salary is 3 times your current rate. The position requires completion of a 6-month logistics management certificate, which the company funds entirely." He paused. "I am not offering you this because of what you did on Thursday night. I am offering you this because you have been in my building for 3 years, and I have never looked at your file, and your file indicates that you are someone this company has failed to develop. That is a business problem and a human problem, and both of them have the same solution." Adaize had not moved from the spot where she was standing. She said, "I do not accept things I have not earned." He said, "This is not a gift. The fund is a company resource that belongs to every eligible employee. The position is a business need. These are not things I am creating for you. They are things that exist and that you qualify for and that you should have been told about long before today." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the refrigerator, at the word list, at speech words, week 19, at the drawings above it. She said, "The therapy. How quickly can it begin?" He said, "I can have the HR paperwork processed by Monday. You could have an appointment by the end of next week." She looked back at him. She said, "I need to think about the position." He nodded. He stood. He understood the difference between a yes that needed time and a no that was being softened. This was the first kind. He walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame and turned back once. He said, "The program has been there for 5 years. That is 5 years it should have been visible and was not. I am sorry for that. Not in the way people say sorry when they mean nothing happened that requires an apology. I mean it as a statement of responsibility." She looked at him with an expression he could not fully read, but in which he recognized, somewhere beneath the surface, the specific quality of a person deciding whether to trust something. He left. On Monday morning, Adaize walked into the HR office on the 4th floor of the Adeola Odeku building for the first time in 3 years of working in it. She had come in through the main entrance, not the service entrance on the side street. This was not a statement. It was simply the correct entrance for where she was going. The HR officer, a young woman named Sola, who wore her natural hair in a high puff and typed very fast, processed the developmental services enrollment in 22 minutes. She was efficient and professional, and at no point during the 22 minutes did she treat Adaize as anything other than an employee completing a standard administrative process, which was exactly what she was. Adaize signed the forms. She received a reference number. She was told the therapy provider network would contact her within 48 hours to schedule an initial assessment. They called the next morning. The speech-language therapist was a woman named Dr. Funmi Adewale, based in a clinic on Bode Thomas Street in Surulere, 12 minutes from Ekena Close, by Keke. She had been practicing for 19 years. She had a quiet room, with low furniture and shelves of picture books, and a way of sitting on the floor with a 5-year-old boy that communicated, without words, that this was his space and his pace, and she was not in a hurry. On Emeka's first session, Dr. Funmi did not ask him to say anything. She sat on the floor with him and watched him sort through a set of picture cards she had placed in front of him. She observed the way he organized them. She noted which images he returned to. When he picked up the card with the moon on it and held it out to her, she took it and placed it in front of both of them and said simply, "The moon." He looked at the card. He looked at her. He looked at his mother through the glass of the observation window, where Adaize was sitting with her hands folded in her lap and her face composed in the particular stillness she had practiced for years on pavements and in corridors, and at kitchen stoves. He looked back at Dr. Funmi. His mouth moved. A sound came out, soft, imprecise, the shape of a word rather than the word itself. But it was aimed at the card. It was aimed at the moon. Dr. Funmi did not react with praise or surprise. She simply nodded once, the way you nod when something happens that you expected to happen and were simply waiting for, and turned the card over and placed the next one down. On the other side of the glass, Adeyeze pressed 2 fingers against her lips. She did not make a sound. The position offer required a longer conversation. Tobena had asked Adeyeze to come to his office on a Wednesday afternoon, 3 weeks after the Saturday morning visit. She had come directly from her day shift, which she had moved to from the night rotation as an interim arrangement while the position was being formally structured. She was in her work clothes, not a uniform. She had already been moved off the custodial team in preparation for the transition. She sat across from him in his 14th floor office with the kind of straight-backed, clear-eyed composure he had come to recognize as simply how she occupied space in the world. Not performed. Constitutive. She asked 3 questions about the position before she accepted it. The first was about the reporting structure, who she would report to, and what the actual scope of the role was. Not the job description language, but the real work, he told her. She nodded. The second was about the certificate program, the schedule, whether the coursework was self-paced or fixed attendance, and whether the company's funding covered materials or only tuition. He told her it covered both, and that he had reviewed the program schedule himself and confirmed it was compatible with a standard working day. She nodded again. The third question was the one he had not expected. She said, "The other people on the night team, the other custodial staff, are they being told about the fund and the development programs?" He was quiet for a moment. He said, "That is being addressed." She looked at him steadily. She said, "That is not the same as yes." He said, "That is not the same as yes." He said, "That is not the same as yes." He said, "That is not the same as yes." He said, "That is not the same as yes." He said, "That is not the same as yes." He said, "That is not the same as yes." Every eligible employee will receive a direct, plain language summary of every program available to them. She held his gaze for one more moment. Then she said, "I will take the position." She stood, extended her hand across the desk, and shook his with the firm directness of someone closing a business agreement rather than accepting a favor. Then she turned and walked to the door. He said her name once. She stopped. He said, "The envelope. I know you know now that it was not the 5,000 I placed. I know you know whose money it was." He paused. "You held $500,000 in your hands at 11 at night, with nobody watching. I want you to know that I understand what that cost." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My father used to say that what is not yours will cost you more than what it is worth." He meant the keeping, not the returning. The returning is free. She left. He sat at his desk for a long time after the door closed. Remy Okafor came to his father's office on a Thursday evening without being summoned. He had been doing that more recently, appearing at the end of the working day, not with an agenda, simply appearing, which was itself a departure from the pattern of the previous 5 years, in which their interactions had been almost exclusively scheduled and almost exclusively about the company. He sat across from his father. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I looked at her file." Tobena waited. Remy said, 3 years. 3 years in the building." He paused. "I have been in the executive rest suite on the 9th floor more times than I can count. I have never. I did not know anyone cleaned it. I mean, I knew someone cleaned it. I did not think about who or what that meant." Tobena said nothing. Remy said, "I left $50,000 on a table and forgot it was there. She earns 68,000 naira a month." He said the numbers in sequence, not dramatically, with the tone of someone reading figures they are trying to understand rather than recite. Those 2 numbers should not exist in the same sentence. They should not exist in the same building. Tobena looked at his son. He said, "Your mother would have known her name in the first week." Remy looked at the desk. He was quiet. Then he said, "I know." They sat in the office in the particular quiet that exists between two people who are not saying everything, but are, for the first time in a long time, saying the parts that matter. Outside the 14th floor window, Lagos was doing what Lagos always did, insisting on itself, loudly and without pause, the generators and the traffic and the particular evening light that came off the lagoon in the hour before dark. After a while, Remy said, "I want to meet her." "Not to apologize," Tobena said. "Not as a transaction." "No," Remy said, "just to know her name." Tobena looked at his son for a long moment. Then he nodded. 6 months later, Adaeze Nwosu completed the Logistics Management Certificate. She had passed every module on the first attempt. She had scored in the top 4% of her cohort on the final assessment. She had done the coursework on a second-hand laptop she had bought from a repair shop on Lagos Island for 12,000 naira, sitting at the kitchen table after the children were asleep, working in the light of the single lamp she had chosen for the apartment, because it was warm, and because warm light mattered, for reasons she had never fully explained to anyone and did not need to. On the day the results came through, Chiamaka found the certificate printout on the kitchen table before Adaeze had a chance to put it away. She read it. She did not say anything. She went to the kitchen drawer where they kept the masking tape, and she tore 2 strips, and she taped the certificate to the refrigerator door. Above the moons. Above the drawings. Above everything. When Adaze came into the kitchen and saw it, she stood still for a moment. She did not take it down. In November, the company rolled out the new benefits communication program. Every hourly employee across Okafor Continental's Lagos operations received a single-page document, plain language, clear categories, specific amounts, no jargon, no 41-page handbook. 1 page, designed in consultation with 3 representatives from the hourly staff team, one of whom was Adaeze, to be readable, practical, and impossible to ignore. The enrollment rate in the Employee Assistance Fund went from less than 2% to 31% in the first quarter. Tobena kept the figure in a small notebook he had started the night he sat in his study and wrote the sentence he had not expected to write. He did not share it in board meetings. He did not put it in the annual report. He kept it in the notebook because it was not a business metric. It was a measurement of a different kind, the kind Ngozi had told him to take. Emeka said his first full sentence on a Tuesday afternoon in December, 8 months after his first session with Dr. Funmi. He was sitting on the floor of the flat on Ikena Close. They had not yet moved. Adaeze was saving, deliberately and carefully, the way she did everything, with a new sheet of paper and a fresh yellow crayon. Dr. Funmi had told Adaeze the week before that his progress had exceeded the standard trajectory for a child with his profile. She had said it in the measured, precise tone of a woman who did not exaggerate clinical outcomes, which meant it was true, and which meant something that Adaeze had been carrying for 4 years without being able to put down, had shifted enough to breathe around. Emeka looked up from his drawing. He looked at his mother. He said, "Mama, I drew you the moon." 5 words. Clear, deliberate, each one in its correct place. Adaeze did not move. She looked at her son on the floor with his yellow crayon and his paper and his 5 words, and she felt something pass through her that was larger than her chest could comfortably hold. She crossed the room. She sat on the floor beside him. She took the drawing from his hands. A yellow circle. The crayon pressed hard into the paper the way he always pressed it, as if the color needed to be permanent, as if he was making sure it would not fade. Below the circle, 2 figures, one tall, one small, standing close enough that you could tell without anyone having to say it that they belonged to each other. She held the drawing for a long time. Then she stood and walked to the refrigerator and pressed it to the door with 2 strips of tape, smoothing the edges down with her thumb, the way she always did, giving it its place among all the other things that mattered. She stepped back. The kitchen was warm. The lamp was on. Chiamaka was at the table with her homework. Emeka was already back on the floor, with another piece of paper and a red crayon, moving on to the next thing in the way of children who have said what they needed to say and are now ready for what comes next. Adaji stood in her kitchen in her life, in the life she had held together with night shifts and skipped lunches and library books and masking tape and the specific stubbornness of a woman who had decided a long time ago that putting things down was not available to her as an option, and she let it hold her. Just for a moment. The way you let yourself be held by something when you have been the one doing the holding for a very long time, and you have finally, without making a drama of it, earned the right to stop and feel the weight of what you carried and how far you carried it, and what it cost and what it built. Tobena Okafor sat in his home study that same evening. The city was loud outside. It was always loud. He did not notice anymore. He opened the desk drawer. He took out Ngozi's letter. He unfolded it along the crease that had gone white from 273 openings. Her handwriting, uneven but firm. You will spend your whole life measuring things. That is who you are. Just make sure that at some point you stop long enough to measure what actually matters. The person who cleaned the floor you walked on today, the driver who waited in the rain, the child whose name you never learned. Those are the measurements that count. He read it. Below her words, in his own handwriting, the sentence he had added the night he sat in this room and finally understood what she had been trying to give him for 17 years. I found her. She was cleaning the floor I walked on, and I almost did not look down. He read both sentences, hers and his. Together they made something complete that neither one made alone. He folded the letter. He placed it back in the drawer. He did not close the drawer immediately. He sat looking at it for a moment, at the folded paper in the dark of the drawer, at the handwriting of a woman who had known him better than he knew himself and had spent 17 years trying to give him the version of himself that could see what she saw. He closed the drawer. He sat in the quiet. Adaeze Nwosu found $500,000 that was not hers. She held it in her hands for 45 minutes. She thought about everything it could have paid for. She thought about her son on a waiting list, and her daughter's school fees, and the rent, and the brother she had not mentioned once in this story, because she had learned to carry certain things in silence, and his name was one of them. She thought about all of it, and then she walked to a reception desk at 11:47 at night, and she put it down. Not because someone was watching, not because she calculated the risk of keeping it, not because she did not need it, because her father had told her, standing in a supermarket checkout line when she was 9 years old, that what is not yours will cost you more than what it is worth, and because she had understood, in the way that children understand the things their fathers say in specific moments, that he was not talking about money. He was talking about who you are when nobody is watching. He was talking about the thing that lives in you after every other thing has been taken. She kept that, and it kept her. There is a Denise in your building. There is an Adaize on your street. There is someone in your life who is cleaning the floor you walk on, holding everything together on 5 hours of sleep and a salary that does not cover what it needs to cover, building something out of nothing with library books and masking tape and a stubbornness that looks like ordinary life from the outside. You may not have a $500,000 envelope to return to them, but you know their name. If you do not, learn it. That is where it begins. If this story stayed with you, share it with one person today. Not because you have to, because somewhere on the other side of that share is someone who needed to hear that the holding is worth it, that it builds something real, that it is seen, even when you believe it is not. Leave a comment below and tell us, have you ever done the right thing when no one was watching? We read every single one. We will see you in the next story.